Does the Christian fundamentalist really believe in the literal word of the Bible as being God's truth? Or are certain passages so ridiculous that even they have to reinterpret them to give some sort of semblance of truth? Stay tuned and I'll give an example of how one of my commenters does exactly that with a good old story of Jonah. I got a comment months ago from the very first video that I put out on debunking Christian fundamentalism. On the thumbnail of the video, it said, "How can an intelligent person be a Christian fundamentalist?" And yes, I am astounded that people of intelligence can be Christian fundamentalists and believe the literal word of the Bible came from God himself. Now, in this video, I noted a few examples of how all reasoning and intelligence goes out the window when you believe in these ridiculous stories of creationism, Noah's Ark and the Great Flood, and I throw in there the story of Jonah. How anyone of any intellect can believe that a man lived in the belly of a whale. Which, of course, someone said immediately, well, actually it was a great fish, and well, actually it was. I'm assuming at that time, thousands of years ago, that they probably didn't understand the difference between the whale, mammal, and a fish. Because a large fish would have been a shark and would have shredded the person versus something that would have swallowed, which would have been a whale. But either way, great fish, whale, it's impossible for a man to survive in the belly of such for 3 days. In which I got this comment from an Ethan who runs a youth group at his Southern Baptist church. And please don't go in and bash him, because he does have his right to present his case, and actually, I want Christians to try to present their case. I'd be thrilled if one of them could convince me to reconvert, but I've yet to find any of their cases convincing thus far. But here was his contention, and he was nice about it. He states that he shows my videos to his youth group as a lesson of how non-believers don't understand the Bible at all. And he was going to straighten me out about the matter of Jonah, what I thought it meant versus what it actually did. And I'm using this example because this is just one little quip, but it really shows the lack of reasoning of the Christian fundamentalist, and more importantly, how they're brainwashing their youth with this complete irrationality. First off, I wonder if Ethan realizes that most of us non-believers were former Christians, whether you're an atheist, agnostic, or unspecified theist like myself. Very few atheists I know were raised by atheists. Most of them came from the church, and usually it was a high-control church, aka fundamentalist. We all deconverted because we did do the research. We've read the Bible. I've read it cover to cover twice. And many parts of it I've read way more than that. And we have all found that when fundamentalists try to justify the Old Testament as being legitimate, or even the New Testament, they don't actually use the literal words like they claim they believe in, verbatim as they say, as the inspired word of God, but they will start interpreting to make it fit their worldview. These interpretations will come in when God shows that he actually wasn't that nice of a character in the Old Testament, when they're completely backed in a corner because of contradictions, or when it's clear that it's just a physical impossibility that something like this could have happened. And here's an example of the commenter Ethan doing just that. His quote in the comment: "I love these videos. I like to show them to our youth group at my Southern Baptist church. It shows others how little atheist YouTubers know of what the Bible teaches or what many Christians actually believe. For example, the video mentions how a man was swallowed by a whale for a few days and lived. Of course, he's speaking of Jonah, but did Jonah live? Is this what the Bible teaches? No. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 39 through 40, we read Jesus saying, 'An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and nights in the heart of the earth.' Did Jesus teach that he was alive in the tomb for 3 days? No, he taught that his body would be in a grave, but his soul would not. Luke 23, verse 43. In Jonah chapter 2, verse 6, we read that he went down to the moorings of the mountains, the earth with its bars closed behind me forever. Yet you have brought up my life from the pit. As I and many others read this, Jonah's soul went to Sheol shortly after the event occurred. Jonah reads as if he had died shortly after being taken by the sea creature. No, Ethan, that's not what it says. That's your interpretation of what it says. First of all, you're using circular reasoning, using later New Testament excerpts from Matthew to prove the Old Testament. One, at best, Matthew was written decades after the resurrection of Christ. Some scholars say at best 30 years after. Others will say 50 plus years. 2, we don't know who wrote Matthew, but whoever wrote it was most likely familiar with Jewish tradition. Seeing a later excerpt written far after Jonah doesn't give credibility to Jonah happening. Basically, Ethan wants us to believe that it isn't far-fetched that Jonah was swallowed by a great fish because he died in the fish's belly, and it was his soul that was resurrected. Well, I'm going to read the excerpts from chapter 2 in the book of Jonah as follows. Jonah chapter 2 verse 1. And the Lord prepared a great fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Verse 2. Then Jonah prayed unto the Lord his God out of the fish's belly. In other words, after 3 days and 3 nights. Clearly says then, one after the other. Now, if he's in the fish's belly, how could he possibly be praying about anything? He's deep in the ocean in the belly of a whale or great fish. He would have been dead within minutes. And if he did somehow pray in those last minutes, then you have to admit that he wasn't there for 3 days and 3 nights, but the passage states he was before he prayed. But let's go further. And it does talk about him going to the bottoms of the mountains and the Lord bringing him up from the pit. That would be verse 7. But then in verse 11, it states the Lord spoke unto the fish, and it vomited out Jonah upon the dry land. In which in Jonah chapter 3, the Lord apparently spoke to him again once on dry land, and in verse 3 of chapter 3, so Jonah arose and went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceeding great city of 3 days' journey. How do you possibly interpret this any other way except Jonah was in the belly of the fish and then he was cast out of the belly of the fish through basically the fish throwing up on dry land? And this is my point. When you finally corner them with a story that's so ridiculous it can't possibly be believable by reasonable people, they try to make it a little more believable by reinterpreting it to try to fit a slightly different worldview. And this is the trap that the fundamentalist sets and then walks right into it. You state that you believe the Bible is the literal word of God. Well, I just read you the words themselves and also compared it to the original Hebrew text, side by side in translation. And they do the same thing in the first few verses of Genesis. They talk about how God created the first day, the second day, but there was no sun yet created to differentiate the days. So then they start reinterpreting the meaning of what God meant in Genesis, because the literal word that you claim you believe to the letter completely contradicts itself, because you can't have the differentiation of days and nights without the sun. And there was no sun in the first few days of Genesis, as it talks about the first, second, and third day. So you reinterpret the literal words of God and mold them to somehow coincide with a belief system that's quite frankly ridiculous. You do this when atheists confront you with God condoning slavery in Old Testament and New Testament. Telling me that God said that the slaves were to be treated well doesn't give a pass that God shouldn't have condoned slavery to begin with. And this is my end point. And I hope, Ethan, that your youth in your ministry is watching this video so they begin to research things for themselves instead of listening to this twisted interpretation of the Bible that you're giving. If you are a fundamentalist and you are going to believe that the Bible is the literal word of God, then you have to believe in the literal word of God. You can't decide that in the story of Jonah, God really meant that it was Jonah's soul that escaped the great fish, when it clearly says the fish threw him up on dry land. If you believe in the literal words, you don't get to reinterpret the story to try to show that the verses are less nonsensical than they are. The fact is, the story of Jonah, as well as the story of Genesis, is complete and utter nonsense. And I just read the literal words to you in response to that long ago comment. And I would suggest that your youth in your ministry in your Southern Baptist Church start confronting you on this, of whether the words are the words, or are the church elders trying to twist and reinterpret the words, which is exactly what a fundamentalist cult does. Now, if you'd like to continue with some videos on how I completely disprove Genesis, hit that end card right now at the end of this video, and I'll see you next time as we once again take that sword of reason and reality and thrust it right through the heart of ignorance.